Chapter 1. The crown was too heavy. Not because of the gold, though there was plenty of it, hammered into elaborate scrollwork and studded with sapphires the color of a drowning sea. No, it was heavy because it belonged to someone else. Mara pressed her fingertips to the cold metal and stared at the woman in the mirror. She had her mother's nose, her father's stubborn jaw, 20 years of poverty written into the calluses on her hands. Hands that were now being slid into silk gloves by women who would never once look her in the eye. The woman in the mirror wore a queen's face. But Mara knew the truth. She was a butcher's daughter from the lower ward. She gutted fish on Tuesdays. She had never once been called beautiful, useful sometimes, sturdy, forgettable. Until the day the Royal Consul's carriage stopped in front of her fish stall, and a man in a black coat stepped out, looked at her face for exactly 4 seconds, and said, "We need to have a conversation about your cheekbones." Chapter 2. The real Queen Isolde had not left her chambers in 11 months. This was not, as the official court announcements proclaimed, due to a period of sacred royal contemplation. It was because she was dying. Slowly. Quietly. The way expensive things break. Not with a crash, but with a hairline fracture that spreads in silence until one morning you reach for it, and it simply falls apart in your hands. The physicians called it Veilsickness, a degenerative condition that attacked the body's ability to regulate its own temperature, leaving the afflicted burning with fever 1 hour and shaking with cold the next. It hollowed you out. It made light painful and sound unbearable. It was, in every measurable way, a miserable way to spend what might be your final year. Queen Isolde was 23 years old. She was also, inconveniently, the only thing standing between her kingdom of Vael and total political collapse. 3 noble houses were already sharpening their ambitions. 2 foreign kingdoms were circling the borders like patient wolves. And across the Ashen Vale Mountains, in the fortress kingdom of Draeven, a king had just sent a formal request for peace negotiations, which everyone in the court knew was diplomatic language for. "I want to see exactly how weak you are before I decide whether to attack." Isolde could not receive him. Isolde could barely sit upright. And so, Lord Consul Fenwick, a man whose entire personality was a series of solutions to problems other people hadn't noticed yet, went looking for a ghost. He found one selling fish. Her name was Mara Voss. Age 20, illegitimate daughter of a merchant who had died of debt and a mother who had died of grief shortly after. She had dark auburn hair that she kept in a practical braid, brown eyes with an unusual amber ring around the iris, and a bone structure that had clearly been assembled by the universe as some kind of clerical error, too precise, too symmetrical, too regal for the fish-stained apron she wore over it. She also had Queen Isolde's exact jaw, her exact brow, her exact height and coloring, and the same way of tilting her head slightly to the left when she was thinking. Fenwick had spent 14 years in service to the crown. He was not a man given to shock. He stood in front of Mara's fish stall for a full 30 seconds, with his mouth slightly open. "How much for the halibut?" Mara asked, because she assumed that was what he was staring at. "I don't want the fish," Fenwick said. "Then move. You're blocking my customers." He liked her immediately. He hired her the same afternoon. The training took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of walking with books on her head. 6 weeks of learning to eat without hunger and smile without feeling and speak without accent. 6 weeks of being stripped of every single thing that made her Mara and rebuilt, layer by careful layer, into something that looked exactly like Isolde. The corset came first. Reinforced whalebone and silver thread, tightened by 2 silent handmaidens until Mara's ribs felt like a cage of snapping twigs. Over it went the silk, yards of it, a deep bruised plum that shimmered like an oil slick under candlelight. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever worn. It was also the most uncomfortable. "Stand still, Lady Alara," the elder maid hissed, using the false name they had given her, the name she would wear in public like a second skin. In the eyes of the council, Mara Voss no longer existed. What stood in her place was Lady Alara, a spy in silk. A weapon wrapped in luxury. She stared at her reflection in the triptych mirror and tried to feel something other than the slow, suffocating weight of someone else's life descending onto her shoulders. The real queen met her only once, on the morning of the 3rd week. Isolde was propped up in her enormous canopied bed, surrounded by enough blankets to smother a horse, her real face pale and sharp with illness, but her eyes were alive in a way the rest of her wasn't. Dark and watchful and terrifyingly intelligent. She studied Mara for a long time without speaking. Mara stood still. She was learning to do that, to exist in silence without filling it. She was discovering, one of the hardest things she had ever been asked to do. "Do you know why this frightens me?" Isolde said finally. "Because I look like you," Mara said. No, Isolde's gaze didn't waver. "Because you don't look like me. You look like what I was supposed to be. Before all of this." A silence fell between them, deep and strange, and the particular shape of grief. "If you fail," Isolde said quietly, "people will die. Not you. Not me. The people in the lower ward. The ones you came from." "I know," Mara said. "And if you succeed?" Mara thought about her fish stall. About the smell of salt and copper and cold morning air. About the life that had been hers, unremarkable as it was. "I go home," she said. Isolde looked at her for one more long moment. "I hope that's still possible," she said softly. "For both of us." Chapter 3. He arrived on a gray morning when the fog sat so low on the valley that his procession seemed to materialize out of nothing. Black horses first, then the standard bearers, then the armored escort, and finally the carriage. Black lacquered wood. No embellishment. No gold. No performance. The court had expected pageantry. What they got was a man who clearly didn't care what they expected. King Caelum of Draeven stepped out of the carriage and paused on the steps of Vael Court Palace with the particular stillness of someone who was already calculating the room before he had entered it. He was younger than the rumors had suggested, 30 at most, with dark hair pushed back from a face that had the angular, unfinished quality of someone who had spent more time in war camps than throne rooms. There was a scar along his jaw, pale and clean, the kind that came from a blade rather than a battle. His eyes, gray, almost colorless in the flat morning light, moved across the assembled court with an expression that was not quite coldness and not quite boredom, but something in between. Assessment. Pure, professional assessment. He looked, Mara thought from her position on the greeting dais, like a man who had learned very early that the world was a problem to be solved and had simply never stopped solving it. She fixed her face into Isolde's expression, composed, gracious, slightly remote, and descended the steps to meet him. This was the moment. 6 weeks of training distilled into a single walk across wet stone. Every breath measured. Every movement deliberate. Don't be Mara. Be Isolde. Be the crown. Be the... He looked at her. Not the polished, courtly glance of a king meeting a queen. Something else. Something quick and unguarded, there and gone in less than a second, like a man who had been expecting a portrait and found a person instead. Mara felt it move through her like a struck bell. "Your Majesty," she said, in Isolde's voice, with Isolde's tilt of the head. "Draeven honors us with your presence." Caelum was quiet for exactly 1 beat too long. "Vael honors me with yours," he said. It was the correct diplomatic response. It was entirely unremarkable. She had no idea why it felt like the beginning of something she wasn't prepared for. Chapter 4. The peace talks were designed to last 10 days. The first 3 were procedural. Maps and treaties and trade agreements, conducted across a table wide enough that neither party had to pretend warmth they didn't feel. Mara played Isolde with the careful precision of someone defusing something explosive. She listened more than she spoke. She let Fenwick handle the details. She performed authority the way she had been taught. Not loudly, not aggressively, but with the particular stillness of someone who didn't need to raise their voice because everyone in the room was already listening. Caelum watched her. She noticed. She wasn't supposed to notice, or rather, she was supposed to notice without reacting, which was somehow worse. He didn't watch her the way men usually watched queens, with calculation or desire, or the particular brand of entitlement that power tends to breed. He watched her the way someone watches a puzzle they can't quite solve. Like there was a question he kept almost arriving at and then losing. On the 4th evening there was a formal dinner. 47 guests. 6 courses. An orchestra playing something melancholy in a minor key behind a screen of flowering vines. Mara sat at the head of the table and performed Isolde with perfect precision and ate almost nothing because Isolde, she had been told. Ate almost nothing, appetite being one of the first casualties of the Veilsickness. Caelum was seated 3 places to her left by protocol. He had been seated next to Lady Vareth, who was beautiful and witty and had been quite deliberately placed there by Fenwick to occupy his attention. Lady Vareth was making every effort. Caelum was making every appearance of listening. But 3 times during the first course Mara looked up and found his gray eyes already on her. The 3rd time, neither of them looked away immediately. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Long enough to be something. Short enough to deny. Mara looked back at her plate and thought, this is a problem. The problem got worse on day 6. A storm rolled in off the mountains and grounded both parties inside the palace. The formal schedule collapsed. Fenwick, to his visible distress, could not manufacture a crisis to end the enforced informality quickly enough. Mara found herself in the East Library at an hour when she should have been safely sequestered in the royal chambers. She had gone because she hadn't slept and the walls of the room they had given her were closing in and she needed, just for an hour, to exist somewhere as herself. She was standing at the window watching the rain make rivers on the glass when she heard the door. She turned. Caelum stopped in the doorway. He was without his formal coat. Just a dark shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a book in one hand. He looked, stripped of the ceremony, startlingly human. Your Majesty. He started to back out. My apologies. I didn't. Stay, she said. The word came out before the training could catch it. Before she could route it through Isolde, soften it into something courtly and distant. He stayed. They sat on opposite sides of the library for an hour, each pretending to read, both not reading at all. The rain hammered the windows. Somewhere deep in the palace a clock struck midnight. You're not what I expected, Caelum said finally. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the rain. What did you expect? She asked. Also looking at the rain. A proxy, he said simply. Someone performing queenship. A face above a policy document. Mara's heart performed a complicated maneuver in her chest. And instead, she said carefully. He was quiet for a moment. When he turned to look at her, the gray eyes had something in them she couldn't name, something that had no business being there in the middle of a political negotiation between 2 kingdoms that had been enemies for 30 years. Instead, I find myself wondering, he said quietly, who you actually are. The clock finished striking. The rain fell. Mara thought, I am nobody. I am a butcher's daughter. I am a ghost wearing a borrowed face. She said, a queen, your Majesty. Nothing more. He looked at her for one long moment, as if weighing the answer against something only he could measure. Strange, he said softly. I don't think I believe you. Chapter 5. She made 3 mistakes over the following days. The first was small. A kitchen girl dropped an enormous tray of silverware outside the corridor where they were walking, and before Mara could stop herself she had spun around and asked if the girl was all right. Not in Isolde's measured tones, but in her own voice, quick and warm and lower than it should have been. She corrected it in an instant. But Caelum had been 2 steps behind her, and she felt his pause like a hand on her shoulder. The second mistake was laughter. They were in the formal gardens on the 8th day, walking the required diplomatic walk with their required diplomatic space between them, when his military advisor, a blunt, sunburned man named Garrett, made a joke so unexpectedly absurd that Mara laughed before she could convert it into Isolde's polite smile. Real laughter. Unguarded and completely her own. It died quickly. But Caelum had heard it. He didn't say anything. He simply looked at her with that expression again, the question he kept almost arriving at. The third mistake was the worst. On the 9th night, a message arrived from the royal physician. Isolde's condition had deteriorated. Rapidly. Critically. Fenwick needed Mara in the hidden chambers immediately. She was crossing the inner courtyard when Caelum appeared from a side passage, and they nearly collided, and his hand caught her arm to steady her, and she looked up at him in the torchlight with her heart hammering and her composure entirely fractured, not as Isolde, not as a queen, but as Mara, stripped bare by fear and proximity and whatever impossible thing had been building in the spaces between words for 9 days. And she saw the exact moment he saw it. Not a flicker of doubt. A certainty. Arriving in his gray eyes like dawn. "You're not her," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a question. It was the quiet, devastated voice of a man who had just understood something that rearranged everything. Mara stepped back. Her mouth opened. The training, the weeks of it, the careful architecture of Isolde's voice and Isolde's posture and Isolde's face, all of it stood ready, all of it useless. "Your Majesty. Don't." His voice was low, almost gentle. "Please don't." The torches flickered between them. "Who are you?" he asked. And in that moment, with the negotiations on the edge of collapse, with a dying queen in a room somewhere above them, with 2 kingdoms balanced on the next words out of her mouth, Mara made the most dangerous choice she had ever made. She told him the truth. If you have enjoyed this story, please support the author by subscribing to the channel. Chapter 6. She told him everything. Not in the courtyard. They moved without speaking to a small alcove off the east passage, hidden behind a tapestry that smelled of dust and old wars. There, in the near dark, with the torch behind them casting long, crooked shadows on the stone, Mara heard herself speak in her own voice for the first time in 6 weeks. She told him about the fish stall, about Fenwick and the carriage and the 4 seconds of assessment, about the corset and the training and the triptych mirror, about Isolde, pale and burning and fighting the Veilsickness with everything she had left, about the hairpin at her nape with its hollow tip and its terrible cargo, about the treaty and the 10 days and the thing that was supposed to happen when all of it was over. She told him about going home. Caelum listened. He didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He had the quality. She had noticed it in the library, and in the gardens, and across the negotiating table of someone who understood that silence was not an absence, but a form of attention. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a long time. Outside, somewhere in the palace, a door closed. A guard changed. The enormous, indifferent machinery of 2 kingdoms continued to turn. "The treaty," Caelum said finally. His voice was careful, deliberate. The voice of a man building something out of words that might collapse if handled wrong. "You were prepared to sign it as her?" "Yes. And your queen, the real one. She sanctioned this. She had no other choice." Another silence. Longer this time. Mara watched his face in the half-dark and tried to read it. She had learned to read rooms and tables and the micro-expressions of ambassadors. She could not read him. He had built himself, she understood, in exactly the same way she had been built these past 6 weeks, layer by deliberate layer, everything essential hidden under the things that were safe to show. "What happens now?" she asked. He looked at her. In the low light, his gray eyes were almost black. "That depends," he said, "on whether you trust me." "I have no reason to." "No," he said. "You don't." He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a small folded document. He held it out. She took it. It was the preliminary treaty framework, the draft that had been circulating since day 2. Except this copy had notations in the margins. Amendments. Significant ones. Ones that shifted several of the more exploitative trade clauses back toward Vael's favor. She looked up at him. "I had them drawn up on day 4, he said quietly. "When I realized the original terms were structured to weaken you over 5 years rather than strengthen both sides. I was going to present them formally tomorrow." "Why?" It was the only question that mattered. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of something said once and meant entirely. "Because the moment I sat across from you at that table, I knew, whatever was happening on the surface of this, that I was not willing to build a peace on the collapse of someone who had that much honor in her eyes." Mara's breath caught. "You didn't know I wasn't her," she said. "No," he said. "But it didn't matter. Whoever she was, whoever you were, I wasn't going to exploit it." The tapestry shifted in a draft. A torch somewhere guttered and recovered. Mara thought about the fish stall. About Isolde in her room of perpetual fever. About Fenwick's careful, calculating eyes and the treaty and the hairpin and the 30-second life she had been promised at the end of all of this. She thought about the library. The rain. 2 seconds across a dinner table that had lasted longer than they should have. "What do you want?" she asked. Caelum looked at her for a long moment. "To finish the negotiations honestly," he said. And after he paused, something moved across his face. Something unguarded and careful and very close to afraid. "I want to find out here when no one is watching." The words landed quietly. They rearranged something. Chapter 7. He didn't expose her. This was the thing she hadn't expected. This was the thing that broke her in a way none of the rest of it had managed to. He went back to his chambers. He slept, or didn't sleep, she suspected, any more than she did. He returned to the negotiating table the following morning and sat across from her and conducted himself with the complete, contained professionalism of a man who had absorbed an enormous shock and chosen, deliberately and consciously, to do nothing with it that would cause harm. The amended treaty was presented. Formally. Through proper diplomatic channels. Fenwick, who had spent the previous night white-knuckled with terror after learning what had happened in the courtyard, sat very still while the amendments were read aloud and did not look at Mara once. The amended terms were better. Significantly better. The Vael Council members stirred with barely concealed surprise. The Draeven advisors looked unsurprised, which told Mara that Caelum had not done this in the night. He had prepared it before. He had walked into these negotiations already intending to be fair. She had not been prepared for a man who was simply good at the work of peace. The final day of talks ran long. There were 3 sticking points: border garrison protocols, river trade rights, and the question of what to do about the Ashenvale Pass come winter. Mara handled all 3 from memory of Fenwick's briefings, speaking in Isolde's cadence, keeping Isolde's stillness, and underneath all of it being entirely, unavoidably herself. Caelum argued across the table from her for 6 hours. He was, she discovered, an exceptionally frustrating person to negotiate with. Not because he was aggressive or dishonest, but because he was consistently, infuriatingly reasonable. He conceded when concession was right. He held firm when holding was right. He made her work for every clause. Halfway through the afternoon session, he said something that made Garrett laugh and 3 of her own advisors smile involuntarily. And Mara had to press her lips together and stare at the treaty document and remind herself with considerable force that she was supposed to be someone else. He caught her doing it. Their eyes met across the table for a fraction of a second. His expression didn't change. But something in it did. The treaty was signed as the last light left the sky. She signed it in Isolde's name. In Isolde's hand, which she had practiced until she could produce it in the dark. The quill scratched across the parchment and the ink dried and 2 kingdoms exhaled simultaneously, the way the world does when it has been holding its breath and finally remembers that it doesn't have to. Caelum signed for Draeven. His eyes didn't leave her face the entire time. Chapter 8. The formal farewell was conducted in the great hall before the full court. 40 witnesses, 6 scribes, 2 ambassadors, and the particular heavy silence of a ceremony that everyone understood was also a performance. Mara stood at the top of the steps in the bruised plum gown and held herself like a queen and performed the final ceremony with a precision that would have made Fenwick weep with professional admiration. Caelum's procession formed in the courtyard below. The black carriage. The standard-bearers. The armored escort, patient as stone in the early morning gray. Everything he had arrived with, assembled to leave. He ascended the steps for the farewell address. Up close, closer than the table had allowed, closer than ceremony usually permitted, he was very still. The way she had learned to be still. The particular stillness of someone who was feeling a great deal and had decided to feel it quietly. The correct farewell was 7 words, prescribed by protocol. "Until peace finds us again, Your Majesty." He said them. Perfectly. Without inflection. Then, so quietly that only she could hear, below the threshold of the scribes and the witnesses and the patient machinery of 2 kingdoms watching. "I'll find you," he said. "Not the crown. You." His gray eyes held hers for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked down the steps and into the morning and was gone. The great doors closed. The court dispersed. Fenwick appeared at her elbow and said something about debriefing and the physician's report and 3 things that required her signature, and Mara nodded and followed him through 3 corridors and 2 antechambers, and didn't hear a single word. Chapter 9. Isolde was worse. The physician's report had not exaggerated. In the 3 days since the crisis message had pulled Mara from the courtyard, the Queen's fever had cycled 4 times. Up, down, up again, each peak a little higher, each trough leaving less behind. She lay in the enormous canopied bed in a room that smelled of lavender and medicine and the particular stale heat of a sick room that had been closed too long. She was awake when Mara came in. That was something. Mara sat in the chair beside the bed, the one the physicians used, pulled close enough to speak quietly, still in the plum gown, still crowned, still wearing the borrowed face. She hadn't had time to become herself again. She wasn't sure, just now, who herself was. "It is done," she said. "The treaty is signed." Isolde's eyes moved to her face. Dark and watchful even now, even through the fog of fever. "Tell me," Isolde said. So Mara told her. All of it. The negotiations, the amended terms, the storm, and the library, and the rain. The courtyard and the tapestry and the truth she had spoken into the dark. The farewell. The 3 seconds. Isolde listened without interrupting. When Mara finished, the Queen was quiet for a long time. Outside the narrow window the sky had gone the deep bruised purple of early evening, the same color, Mara thought distantly, as the gown. "He amended the treaty," Isolde said finally. Before he knew. "Yes." Another silence. "And you told him the truth." "I did." "And he did not use it." "No." Isolde closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something in them had shifted. Some calculation completed, some door opened. "He is going to come back," she said. It was not a question. Mara thought of gray eyes and 3 seconds, and a voice beneath the threshold of witnesses. "Yes," she said. "I think he is." "Then we have a problem," Isolde said. "Because the woman he is coming back for doesn't officially exist." Mara looked at her. The crown was still too heavy. It would always be too heavy. "What are you saying?" Isolde reached out slowly, with effort, and touched Mara's hand. It was the first time she had touched her. The first time they had been anything other than a queen and her shadow. "I'm saying," Isolde said quietly, "that perhaps it's time to let the ghost have a name." Chapter 10. It took 3 months. 3 months of careful, patient work by Fenwick, who turned out to be as talented at constructing identities as he was at dismantling them. Mara Voss was officially declared to be a distant cousin of the royal house of Vael, rediscovered during an audit of provincial records. A minor noble. Legitimate enough to exist at court. Unremarkable enough not to invite close scrutiny. It was, Fenwick admitted with something approaching satisfaction, some of his finest work. Mara spent those 3 months learning how to be herself again. Or rather, learning who herself was now, because the woman who had come out the other side of 10 days in a queen's borrowed face was not quite the same as the woman who had gone in. The fish stall felt like another lifetime. The practical braid and the fish-stained apron felt like costumes now, the same way the crown did. She was neither. She was something in between. Something that was still resolving itself. Isolde improved. Slowly, unevenly, with setbacks that terrified everyone who knew about them. Which was a carefully controlled number of people. The Veilsickness did not release its grip cleanly. It retreated the way water retreats from a shoreline, leaving some of itself behind each time, but it retreated. By the 2nd month she was sitting up for hours at a stretch. By the 3rd she had walked to the window and stood in the light and looked out at the kingdom that had been surviving without her. "You saved it," she told Mara, one afternoon when they were alone. "You saved it," Mara said. "You were the one who was willing to be replaced." Isolde looked at her with those dark, watchful eyes. "That is a harder thing than it sounds," she said. "I know," Mara said. "I watched you do it." They had become, without quite intending to, something that did not have a clean name. Not friends, exactly. Not equals. Something more complicated and more honest than either. Two women who had looked at each other across the strange abyss of a shared face and seen something true. The letter from Draeven arrived on the first day of the 4th month. It was addressed to Lady Alara of Vael, the name they had kept in the official correspondence, the name that formed the bridge between the ghost and the person. The seal was black wax. No embellishment. No performance. Mara held it for a long time before she opened it. Inside, in handwriting that was precise and unhurried and somehow entirely him. I told you I would find you. I have been patient, which I understand is not a quality you would necessarily expect from me based on our professional interactions. I would like to continue our conversation, the one that began in a library during a storm, not the one about trade routes and garrison protocols, though I am prepared to discuss those as well if required. I will be in Vael for the quarterly border review at the end of the month. I am not asking permission. I am providing information so that you have time to decide what to do with it. See. Mara read it twice. Then she read it again. Then she set it down on the table in front of her and looked out the window at the courtyard below, the same courtyard where 9 months ago he had looked at her face in torchlight and seen what was actually there. She thought about the fish stall, about going home, about the life that had been hers before all of this. She thought about the library, the rain, 2 seconds across a dinner table that had changed direction. She picked up a quill. Chapter 11. She wrote back 4 words. I will be here. They were, she decided, the truest thing she had written in a very long time. Not a queen's words. Not a ghost's. Not a woman performing the role of someone else in borrowed silk. Just hers. Caelum arrived on a Thursday. Not with a procession. Not with standard bearers or armored escorts or black lacquered carriages. He rode in with 4 men and dismounted in the courtyard with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who had no interest in being announced. Mara was already there. She was wearing deep blue, her own choice, nothing borrowed, nothing bruised plum. Her dark auburn hair was down, the way she used to wear it before 6 weeks of aristocratic updo had made her forget she had the option. She had her mother's nose and her father's jaw and the amber ring in her eyes that Fenwick had first seen across a fish stall and decided was the most valuable thing in the lower ward. She was, for the first time in nearly a year, entirely herself. Caelum crossed the courtyard and stopped in front of her and looked at her face with those gray eyes that she had spent months learning to stop thinking about and had failed. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then, "You're not wearing the crown," he said. "No," she said. "I'm not." Something moved across his face. Something that had been there since a library and a rainstorm and 2 seconds across a dinner table, finally arriving at its destination. "Good," he said quietly. "I didn't come for the crown." The courtyard was still. Somewhere above them, behind a narrow window, a pale queen with dark watchful eyes stood in a square of light and did not look down. Mara thought. I was a ghost wearing a borrowed face. I came from nothing. I am no one's first choice and no one's obvious answer. She thought, I am also, apparently, exactly who he came looking for. She said, "Then you had better come in." Later, much later, after a dinner that lasted 3 hours and a conversation that covered everything from trade policy to the smell of cold Tuesday mornings near the harbor, they stood at the window of the East Library. The same window. The same rain, as if the sky had held it for them. "Can I ask you something?" Caelum said. "You've been asking me things since the moment you arrived. I don't think my permission is the deciding factor." He almost smiled. It did something complicated to his face, the scar along his jaw, the angular lines of someone who had lived harder than he had been required to. She was, she realized, already fluent in his expressions. She had learned them across a negotiating table and a rainstorm and 9 months of a letter she had read approximately 40 times. "The fish stall," he said. "Do you miss it?" She thought about it. Genuinely. She thought about the salt and the copper and the cold morning air and the simplicity of a life that asked nothing of her except that she show up and do the work. She thought about the triptych mirror and the crown that was too heavy and the woman in the reflection who had looked back at her and not quite recognized herself. She thought about Isolde's hand on hers, and the 4 words she had written, and the man standing beside her in an East library while rain made rivers on the glass. Sometimes, she said honestly. But less than I expected. He nodded. Like the answer made sense to him. Like most of her answers did. Mara, he said. It was the first time he had used her real name aloud. It landed differently than she had anticipated. Like something put down after a long carry. Like something, finally, set free. Yes, she said. I would like to, he stopped. Started again. The man who was never at a loss for measured, deliberate words, looking for the right ones. This is outside my area of competence. Most worthwhile things are, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, in the amber light, dust motes drifted slowly through the dark. Neither of them were ghosts anymore. Love getting lost in a good story? Subscribe now to unlock our full library of immersive tales and never miss a new release. Thanks for watching.